Welcome to Positive Psychological Warfare. My name is Lynn Johnston, and I'm looking forward to sharing with you some of the things I've learned about how to be happier in pretty much every aspect of life by using positive psychological warfare techniques on yourself. This whole thing started for me when I read How Full Is Your Bucket by Tom Rath and Donald O. Clifton. It's a book about the forces of positivity and negativity in the human psyche, and it talks a lot about how you can manage these forces to have a better mindset, to have a better life, basically. And when I read this book, so all these light bulbs went off for me. I was so excited. I thought, oh my gosh, this is it. This is the missing piece that I have been looking for. Everything is going to change from here on out. And so I read the book. After I read it, I actually went back and reread parts of it that I thought were particularly applicable to me. And then I set it down and I waited for my life to change. But of course, as so often happens with self-help books, I read the book, and then after the kind of happy glow had faded from all the positive things I'd read, I found myself falling back into the same old habits, falling back into patterns of negative thinking, and basically my life hadn't changed. And I looked at that and I said, okay, there were so many good ideas in these books. Why haven't they changed my life? And of course, the answer is because I needed to find a way to apply them. It's not enough just to read it, you have to do it. So I actually went back to this book and I started creating some exercises for myself to help myself apply these ideas. And everything that we're going to talk about in the rest of this Simpleology project is basically what I came up with in order to basically force myself to start using the things I learned by reading this book. One of the things in the book that blew me away was a story that the authors relate about North Korean POW camps. These camps were boggling the minds of the military and military psychologists, because when the soldiers came back from the war, one of the things that we discovered was that these North Korean camps had a 38% death rate, even though they were giving the soldiers enough food, water, and shelter. They were experiencing relatively few instances of torture and physical abuse. The conditions were actually relatively humane compared to every other POW camp in recorded history, and yet they had the highest death rate of any POW camp in recorded history, and 50% of these deaths were caused by the loss of will to live. The POWs who came back talked about what had happened to their friends, and basically a lot of the soldiers basically just reached a state of total hopelessness where they just didn't want to live anymore, and they would crawl into their huts and pull a blanket over their heads, and a day or two later they'd be dead. Not because there was anything physically wrong with them, because they'd lost their desire to live. And furthermore, these camps, they didn't have any barbed wire. They had a few guards, but they weren't nearly as secure as a regular POW camp would be. And yet, most of the soldiers who were trapped in them didn't try to escape. And naturally, when we found this out, everybody was wondering, why? What the heck were these North Koreans doing that were allowing them to so totally demoralize the troops they were holding without any of the usual techniques? And the psychologist who the military asked to study this, William E. Meyer, he said after he studied these soldiers, he interviewed about 1,000 of them who had come back from the camps, and he said that the soldiers had been put into a kind of emotional and psychological isolation, the likes of which we have never seen. And basically he discovered that the North Koreans did this with 4 very basic psychological warfare techniques. They isolated the soldiers from society. They isolated the soldiers from community. They isolated the soldiers from loved ones. And then they isolated the soldiers from self. And by self, I think what we're really talking about is the part of themselves that they believed was good. And the way they did this, they would undermine trust in superior officers. and in the government that they represented, to the point where the soldiers lost faith in the government and the people back home that they were fighting for. The isolation from community, the North Korean guards would reward prisoners for informing on each other for very small things, things that didn't matter. And the people who were getting caught, the people who were getting informed on, they didn't get punished for doing whatever minor infraction they had done. They just, it wasn't about punishing people for breaking the rules. It was about basically getting the prisoners to turn on each other so that nobody trusted anybody else, and everybody was focused on like watching what other people were doing so that they could inform and get a reward, or basically like not wanting to interact with anyone because you were afraid that the person you were interacting with was going to inform on you. So they totally took away that trust that allows you to form bonds with the people around you and be in a community. Isolation from loved ones. The North Korean guards would give prisoners letters from home, but they would redact all the good news, black it out, so that the only news people got in these camps were bad news. They were getting news about loved ones dying, and they were getting letters requesting divorce and all these horrible, horrible things that were happening at home, but then they weren't getting any of the good news from their families and their friends. And the North Koreans actually went so far as to actually deliver collection letters for overdue bills, to just like anything negative that they could give the prisoners from home so that they just felt disconnected emotionally from the people they'd left behind. They did that. And isolation from self. The way they achieve this, and again, we're talking about like what is good about yourself, or your good self-image, your image of yourself as a good person. Basically what they did was they would have this evil, deranged form of group therapy where they would have the prisoners stand up in front of all their peers and confess bad things that they had done. And also, which is was a little surprising to me, but it makes sense when you think about it. They also made them confess things that they could have done for other people that were good, that they chose not to, or for some reason couldn't do. So basically, not just recounting all the bad things they'd done, but also pointing out all these opportunities to be a good person that these soldiers had missed or had let slip by. And these four things isolated the soldiers and made them feel like there was no one they could depend on, no one they could trust, no one that they had a relationship with that was basically worth living for. And that's how the North Koreans basically put these soldiers into such a hopeless, negative state of mind that many of them just gave up and died. And I just want to point out, these seem really extreme, right? Most of us are not being forced to stand up and confess every bad thing we've ever done, or most of us are not being bribed to inform on the people that we work with. But there are some much more subtle versions of these four psychological techniques that we do engage in. Sometimes we do it because maybe we feel a little pressure from other people, or we're just in a bad mood. Whatever. There's always reasons that we can slip into these, but it's easy not to recognize them. For example, in terms of isolation from society, if you are glued to the news, you are getting a huge influx of bad news and a very small influx of good news. And I'm not saying you should never watch the news, or saying that you should like basically ignore what's going on in the world, but I just want to point out, you have control over how much time you're going to spend being focused on that. And maybe you want to think about like, what news do you really need in order to live your life, versus what news is basically gossip that's being passed around about celebrities, or a lot of political debate that's very focused on smearing and attacking instead of focusing on actually trying to fix issues. News stories that kind of blame at the societal level, or engaging in personal blaming of societal level, people who it's really easy to get into that, oh, like, yeah, the system is messed up and that's why I'm not succeeding, or everything's slanted against me, or engaging in like us versus them language, being very focused on like, well, my group is good, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat or I'm a Libertarian and we're good, and those other guys in those other political parties are bad. And I'm not saying that this is going to kill you, but I'm saying you're adding to your negativity every day that you engage in these behaviors. And these behaviors basically mentally isolate you a little bit from society. I'm not saying that a little bit of isolation from society might not be bad. Maybe occasionally you do want to detach a little from society and center yourself. But if you're doing this to yourself all the time, you're basically increasing the negativity of your mindset. Isolation from community. We're not informing on everybody around us for treats, but occasionally everybody gossips, bad mouths other people, is really judgmentalism, maybe is inappropriately competitive with somebody at work, or feeling the need to like be a little bit competitive with a family member who's always one-upping you. Or basically blaming at the community level, basically looking at the community you're in and saying, yeah, well, the reason I'm not successful, or the reason I don't have what I want, is because the company rules suck, or the people who are around me are trying to hold me back. So basically, these are all small versions of that psychological warfare technique of isolating yourself or being isolated by someone else from your community. Isolation from loved ones. We all have a bad day and we need to vent sometimes, but if all you're doing when you're talking to your family and friends, and I'm including friends in the category of loved ones, people you're close to, you're driving a little bit of a wedge between you and the people who are listening to you. Talking behind other people's backs, withholding affection in order to get what you want, blaming your family for where you are in life. Again, maybe your family is responsible in part for where you are in life, and maybe there's something you really do need to complain about. But you just want to think about, if you find yourself engaging in these behaviors habitually, or if you find yourself entering a period of your life where you're starting to engage in them for some reason, you want to look at it, because you're basically isolating yourself from loved ones and increasing the amount of negativity in your life. And finally, isolation from self. And these are things that we do. Some of these we think are actually good things. Refusing compliments or deflecting compliments. That's actually a way of isolating you from the things that are good about you. You're basically like, oh yeah, I'm just going to shove aside other people's good opinions of me, and I'm going to focus on what's wrong with me and what I need to fix and what I know I'm not doing right. Overreacting to criticism is kind of the same. It's like the other side of that coin. Basically just like having a cow and going into a tailspin every time someone sends a negative comment your way. Even if it's constructive, sometimes it's easy to go into that tailspin. Obsessing over whether other people are accepting you. Blaming yourself for things that you don't have any control over. And this one, we all do this one, using should statements and saying, I should do this, I should go work out, I should go do laundry, I should stay up late and finish that project from work. That should statement is basically you pointing out to yourself that there's a good thing you could be doing that you're not doing right now. It's one of those psychological warfare techniques. So the question becomes, now that you realize that you are already using negative psychological warfare techniques on yourself every day, all the time, what are you going to do about it? And of course, the antidote to these 4 techniques of isolation is connection. Connecting yourself very mindfully and consciously to society, to your community, to your loved ones, to yourself and what's good about you. And also, I think I want to point out that you want to be a little bit selective about how you're going to engage with each of these four things. You don't just want to say, okay, I go from rejecting and isolating myself from people and society and what's good about me to I just let everybody else do whatever they want to me. That's not what we mean by connection. By connection, we're going to very consciously and very thoughtfully choose how we are going to connect in each of these four ways. So, these four positive psychological warfare techniques for connection to society, we're going to replace blame with gratitude and with an attitude of responsibility for our contribution to society. Instead of thinking of society as something that is doing things to you, thinking of society instead as something that we are all contributing to. And the good news is you get to choose what you want to contribute. The second one, connection to community, replacing gossip and inappropriate competitiveness with helpfulness. So this is basically about contribution at a smaller level, contributing in your community and in small ways. We're not talking about going out and starting a nonprofit foundation for the homeless necessarily, or giving all your goods to the poor. We're talking about all the small opportunities that you have every day to be helpful, to help other people with whatever they need, or just help them out by making them a little bit happier through the way you interact with them. And finally, the fourth technique, connection to self. Basically, we want to shift from self-consciousness to self-understanding, which leads to self-acceptance. So basically, instead of being focused on the negative and freaking out about how we might not be the best people ever, or we might not be perfect, instead trying to focus on, okay, what is good about me and how can I do more of that? And often the connection to self feeds these other three techniques. If your connection to yourself and what is good about you is strong, it's a lot easier to be generous with the people around you. So let's get started. For the next 21 days, you're going to be taking a few minutes every day to connect in a couple of different ways. I wanted to keep it really simple and really easy for you to do this. I didn't want this to have to be something you spend hours on every day. So I've just broken it up. Every day there will be a small action that you'll be asked to take that will, in one of these four ways, connect you. And each day I'll also give you a question that I'll ask you to write about. And when I say write about, it's okay for you if you don't have time or the inclination to sit down and write out your answers. It's okay for you to think about the question for a little bit, meditate on it, maybe answer it out loud. There's a value psychologically to hearing yourself talk about how you feel. It's another way of externalizing your thoughts and your feelings in such a way that parts of your brain that are not paying attention so much to what's going on in your head, parts of your brain that evaluate what other people say will also make it easier for you to evaluate what you say. So I do recommend that if you don't write it, you do say your answer to the question out loud. And I'm assuming that you're going to do this in the morning, since Simpleology is very much focused on starting the day right. If you do it in the evening, that's fine. It's not a problem. It'll work either way. But when you do it in the evening, you're probably going to want to take the action the next morning or the next day. And a lot of the questions assume that you're doing it in the morning. I'll be asking occasionally you to contemplate something happened on the previous day. So if you're doing it in the evening, you want to answer the questions as if it was happening. You'll be wanting to look at your current day instead of the previous day. It's going to be really obvious once we get into it. The questions are very simple. The actions are very simple. This is basically designed to help shift you into a more positive mindset by helping you reestablish broken connections or maybe strengthen connections that you already have to your community, to society, to your loved ones, and to yourself. So it's not something you should be spending hours on. It's just something very small and subtle, but that will affect your whole day. If you do it first thing in the morning, it'll affect how you think about your interactions with people. It will affect how you interpret other people's behavior, and it will help you stay in a more positive mindset. So here we go. Why don't you go ahead and close this and move on to day 1.